Yeah. Good evening. Welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the NACLA issue launch this evening. We're very excited to have some great guests with us tonight, and also very excited that all of you could come and make it. I'm Brett Gustafson, co-editor along with Nikki Fabricant of this issue, and just going to say a few things about NACLA, which is a journal that, of course, hopefully all of you are reading. That's why you're here. Personally, I've been reading it since I was a little kid, back in the Reagan era, and one of the best journals that you can get critical insights on Latin America on, and that's what we're hoping to continue going forward into what will be NACLA's 50th anniversary next year. Yeah. So 50 years of critical insights on Latin America. You all will have seen this inside your brochure that you've got, and I've been asked to draw your attention to a couple of things on it. Number one, of course, the website where you can subscribe to the journal. And the second thing is the upcoming conference and issue on Latin East is on the back of your brochure there, information on the issue that will look at relations between Latin America and the Middle East. And I'll just take the opportunity that I have to say thank you to Alejandro, the editor here, as well as Laura Weiss and Sam and other folks from NACLA, Lauren, who helped put this issue together, and as they helped to put all the issues together. This particular issue on fossil fuels was an attempt to create a space of conversation about of course, the problematic of fossil fuels, which we're all familiar with, but in Latin America, of course, there's a long history of engagement with fossil fuels from the popular nationalist and left perspective as a possibility for national liberation, which has come into some difficult situations, as we all know. So part of the purpose of the issue was to have a conversation about those contradictions, and also draw attention to some of the impacts of fossil fuel expansion elsewhere in Latin America, including fracking, which is spreading in Argentina, becoming soon to Bolivia, is probably coming soon to a neighborhood near you, unfortunately. And we're very happy to have some wonderful visitors tonight, and I'll turn it over to Nikki to introduce our guests.
So thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. We hope that tonight the focus of the conversation will be about fossil fuels, fossil capital, and especially resistance and movement building. We hope that some of our panelists will be talking about just alternatives across borders. So we bring together scholars, journalists, organizers focused on the question of environmental justice, sustainable energy, and a livable future across borders. From New York to Houston to Oaxaca and Puerto Rico, we hope that we can kind of crisscross borders here tonight and begin really imagining collectively what these alternatives would look like. So we're excited. We're so excited to be here. Cannot wait to engage in this conversation about some of our most pressing environmental and economic problems of this era. We wanted to thank a few sponsors, especially New Politics and DSA Climate Justice, who helped us co-sponsor the event tonight, PSC CUNY EJ Committee, and a special thanks to Tom Cruise and the Board of Directors. So who do we have here tonight? We have Elizabeth Jean-Pierre, who is an internationally recognized Puerto Rican attorney and environmental climate justice leader, who's the executive director of Uprose, Brooklyn's oldest Latino community-based organization. She's been a large part of some of the leadership of the People's Climate March mobilization and has been actively fighting to build a climate justice movement here in New York. We have right next to her, woohoo, Elizabeth. I'm sure many people have certainly followed the incredible work she's doing in Puerto Rico in the aftermath of the hurricane. So we're very excited to have her here tonight. Next to her is Brian Parras, who is an organizer with Beyond Dirty Fuels campaign, the Sierra Club. And he's a longtime environmental justice advocate. He co-founded Texas, Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services, which is dedicated to providing community members with the tools necessary to create sustainable, environmentally healthy communities by educating individuals on health concerns and implications arising from environmental pollution. You have longer bios of everyone in your pamphlets, so we're just going to briefly introduce everyone, but Brian is here with us tonight.
And before I introduce Todd, I should also say thank you to Verso for hosting us in this beautiful space and for publishing wonderful books. Todd Miller is our next guest here. He's written and researched about border issues for more than 15 years, an independent journalist and writer, and his latest book, I believe, is up there on the table for you to check out, Storming the Wall, Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security, published by City Lights. Todd, glad you're here. And finally, Alexander Dunlap, scholar in the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, and I'll get this wrong.
Vrije Universiteit.
Yeah, Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam, who has done some amazing work on the sort of counterintuitive link between counterinsurgency politics and the development of wind energy in the isthmus of Oaxaca and Mexico. So, Xander, thank you for being here. So, the format, basically, we have some questions that we're going to pose to our guests, and asking each of them to respond briefly to those and see where the conversation goes. And then, depending on how that goes and time goes, we'll open it up to audience questions in a little bit. And Elizabeth has to leave at 8:30 for another event, so we'll jump right in.
Okay, so the first question is, we'd like for each panelist to describe briefly how fossil fuel regimes came to intersect with your work, either activist, academic, or journalistic work.
Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Buenos días, mi gente. Okay. Can you hear me? All right, cool. Well, I work in Sunset Park, and Uprose is located in the largest significant maritime industrial area in New York City. And I'm part of the environmental justice movement and co-chair of the Climate Justice Alliance. And I think that the way that our work started, at least the way that it started for me, isn't just that I'm a descendant of colonization and slavery, and that my community and my family has always lived in environmental justice communities and has had all of the health disparities that one would find in those communities, is that we realized that we couldn't fight against police abuse. We couldn't fight for housing, against discrimination, against racial profiling if we couldn't breathe. And so we started working on environmental justice issues because of the disparate siting of the environmental burdens in communities of color. And we also liked the fact that the environmental justice movement was led by the people impacted, that the justice part has to do with the fact that we speak for ourselves, and that's true of the climate justice movement. And so, so one of the first campaigns that we had was fighting against the siting of a 520 megawatt power plant in Sunset Park. It was called Sunset Energy Fleet. It would have been the size of 3 football fields. And it was an intergenerational fight. The youngest organizer at the time, I believe, was about 10 years old. And we were able to win that. And we didn't fight it because it was a climate fight or a fossil fuel fight. We fought it because of the co-pollutants. And I think that there's a big difference between the environmental justice movement and those of us who, and the climate change movement. The climate change movement has historically focused on carbon. And so the climate change movement has supported markets like cap and trade. And the climate justice movement has not, because we don't want to commodify pollution, and we want to make sure that we are addressing the impact of siting these facilities in our communities. So that's how we started. That's how we started, and we've moved a long way since in terms of the work that we're doing, and now locally we're working on community-owned solar, offshore wind. We've doubled the amount of open space. We've stopped the siting of power plants. We've built leadership. We've done a number of things just in Sunset Park alone, and as a movement, we've pretty much kicked ass. So I say that, and I also talk about leadership because this is a room that is predominantly melanin challenged. It is a pretty white room. And I think sometimes folks talk about justice and they talk about climate justice and they feel entitled to lead our movements, to helicopter into our communities and to frame the issues for us. We always offer the Jiménez Principles for Democratic Organizing as the roadmap for how you come into communities respectfully and ensure that you're not supplanting local leadership, but that you're supporting the work being done by the front line. And so that is one of the big reasons why I like the climate justice movement, because I felt like we have moved from a time that people set the issues and the framework for us to a time that we did that for ourselves, particularly because our people are the descendants of extraction and because we have to lead the struggle on climate change. I don't know if you want me to answer the other questions or you're gonna go one person after the other to answer one question and then the other?
So, yeah.
Okay. All right. So I basically that's how we started, and so I think that the story of Uprose is also the story of the Climate Justice Alliance, where you've got a national organization made up of 50 groups all over the country, from Detroit to the Bay and from Brooklyn down to New Orleans, who have been fighting extraction for generations. For us, it's not a new issue. It's been a survival issue for generations. And we know that climate change is going to affect our communities more than any other. And so we have to lead on that, particularly because we always talk about the fact that by 2042, we will be the majority in the country. At the time, we used to say at the time when climate change would have fully taken hold. But in this year alone, we had the fires in California, we had Harvey in Texas, Irma in Miami, and Maria in Puerto Rico, and it pretty much affected every inch of Puerto Rico. And so for the Global South, and for places that have been colonized and have a unique relationship with the United States that's based on dependency, like Puerto Rico, what climate change means is also the possibility for people who think they care about us deepening our colonization and opening the door for disaster capitalism at a level that can make our heads spin. So that's our biggest challenge right now, and I'm happy to talk more about that later.
I'm going to pull this off.
Rock star.
It was perfectly spaced. That's a loaded question. And, I feel like a lot of what Elizabeth said is very familiar to me, too. And I always look at the fight against the fossil fuel industry and extraction more generally as an intergenerational issue for myself, but for all people of color. This entire continent was colonized based on the motto of extraction, looking for gold, looking for resources. And, even personally, I think about that because of where my parents come from. They grew up in West Texas, in the Permian Basin, and in some small towns called Big Spring, Forsan, and it was a place where even, when I was a young kid, we were unable to drink the water there from the faucet, the tap water. How many people, back in the 70s and 80s lived in a place where you weren't able to drink the water? Let me see your hands. No one. There's about 100 people here. No one. And this is a place, I see a hand. This is a place, Big Spring, named after water holes in a very arid climate, in a desert area that had been used for thousands of years during, migrations to and fro the Southwest and Mexico and beyond, as a place of refuge. And, I thought about that when I was little because it was strange that I could drink water in Houston, but then not drink the water in Big Spring. And I'd forget sometimes. And, I'd take a big gulp, and it was disgusting. It tasted awful. And yet, we bathed in that water. We brushed our teeth in that water. We cooked sometimes. in that water. And my grandmother died when I was in third grade from a surgery. She was having a kidney transplant, and it, went wrong. There were a lot of other overlapping issues that I think we also experience that I won't go into right now. But the fact that, she was on dialysis for 10 to 15 years, I think says a lot about where she grew up too, and the toxins that she had been exposed to. And if you look at the area, in a Google map, Big Spring, Fort Sand, and you look at the landscape, it looks like a computer chip, with a bunch of little squares represent all the little drill pads. They look like little solder points. And, it's kind of interesting, to think of it that way, but, there's thousands, tens of thousands of drill sites. And this is where my mom grew up, as a young child. So she was exposed to these things, at a time when the Clean Air Act didn't exist. And my grandmother, raised her family there. And, the more I learned, the more I realized that the toxins that they were exposed to, had an impact even on my biology, on my DNA. So this stuff translates across generations, and it helped me better understand, the importance of our environment and how that really affects the potential, not just for the people who are exposed to it right then and there, but their ancestors, their offspring. And it made me think of all the other things that we had been exposed to. My grandfather was a farm worker and, was exposed to countless numbers of pesticides that were also derivatives of the oil and gas industry. Cosmetics, plastics, all these things that became very familiar to me the more I looked into Houston and where I grew up along the Houston Ship Channel. And, that just opened up a whole other world. So when Elizabeth talks about, the issue of climate change and how there's this, very, very big focus on one particular item, carbon dioxide, we have to remember that there are thousands of chemicals that people are also exposed to, many of which have never been tested, that we put on our bodies, that are produced in places like Houston and Louisiana, Jersey, all over the country, oftentimes in communities of color, low-income communities. And so that's sort of how I got started. And, I was fortunate enough to be graduating from college when my dad had come back from Louisiana, having worked on some really, really early environmental justice cases in Louisiana. And it's, something that made us really think about the place where I grew up, where I was raised. And so that's why we started Tejas, because there was no one looking at our communities, no one speaking for us, and no one addressing these systemic issues in a more holistic way. And so, we've continued that work. Houston's a tough place, but it ironically was actually built on the cusp of the worst environmental disaster to this date in terms of loss of life. And that was the great storm of 1900 in Galveston, killed over 8,000 people. So hurricanes are not something that are new to the region, but they've certainly changed. And what hasn't changed is people's mindset. We still think we can control, the forces of nature, and that, we can engineer our way out of things. But as we've seen, in the last couple of years, Houston's already suffered 3-4 major floods that are supposed to only happen, once every 500 years. So the math is off. The really, really smart people who have it in their heads that they have planned for this sort of thing haven't. And it's come at the expense of people's lives. And that's what compels me and, helps me remember, why this work is needed. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, I come into the subject journalistically, really connecting, looking at climate change, displacement of people, and homeland security, but particularly borders, like militarized borders. And there's many ways I could begin to talk about that, but one of the things that first strikes me is that when you look at historic greenhouse gas emitters like the United States or countries that compose the European Union, the United States since 1850 has contributed like 27% of greenhouse gas emissions. European Union or countries therein, 25%. And then if you look further, those are the places that are they're most involved with a sort of worldwide global militarization. And what I look at in my work is the militarization of borders. One example, or of many, many examples that I could point out, is you just have to go to the Pentagon. Pentagon has been doing a lot of assessments looking at the future in terms of climate and climate disruption. One of the earlier rudimentary assessments was in 2003, where the Pentagon was looking at, or the commissioned report was looking at a worst case climate scenario. And in that assessment, they used the word using numbers of predictions of forecasts of displacements of people. And if you don't know the forecasts of people, the kind of forecasts of people that are going to be displaced due to climate change, there's a number of forecasts out there, and they range widely. They're widely debated, ranging from about 150 million people to about 1 billion or even 2 billion people by 2050 or 2100. There's obviously, we know that there's much more to why people leave their homes or are displaced. There's a numbers of factors that we could talk about, political, economic, but increasingly we have to talk about how the ecological element is compounding or converging with these other elements. And so the predictions and projections are dire and even astronomical as we look into the future. And the Pentagon, when they're doing these sorts of assessments that they do, are actually looking at those numbers. And this assessment that I was just referring to uses these are the precise words. The United States and Australia will have to build defensive fortresses around the countries to stop and quote unquote unwanted starving immigrants from Mexico, the Caribbean, and then they put in parentheses an especially severe problem, which is definitely going into what has been talked about already, and in a way that's we could discuss further, right? And then South America, and so really that's quote unquote. So they don't put Central America in there, which is actually becoming one of the hot spots of climate change. In fact, one climate scientist told me, well, this is the ground zero of climate change we're seeing in the Americas. But that's another statement, that climate change obviously is affecting everywhere, and Central America particularly because it's an isthmus and there's big bodies of water on either side, and there's tremendous dry spells and droughts that have been affecting the isthmus of Central America and are projected to increase in intensity in the future. And so that assessment from 2003 happened right at the exact same time when the Department of Homeland Security was coming to be in the United States. And so, it's kind of a coincidence, and maybe there's many different reasons why the Department of Homeland Security formed. But at that precise moment, the kind of money, the flood of money that was going into the DHS and then the border, and looking at the U.S.-Mexico border precisely, or you can look at the grand idea of a border that the United States has. The U.S. Border Patrol doubled in size. The approximately 700 miles of walls and barriers were built on the U.S.-Mexico border, all kinds of high-tech technology, lots of surveillance equipment like drones, that sort of thing, and I could go on and on and on about it. And so you have this idea of a defensive fortress and this buildup of the U.S. border, again, for many different reasons. But at the same time, the Pentagon was getting more savvy with their reports, and a report about as thick as this book came out around 2008. And this book, it was called Climatic Cataclysm. And in that book, they actually look at climate change in terms of future projections for different temperatures, 1.6 degrees by 2050, 2.6 degrees by 2050, and so on. The purpose for looking at that was that it takes the military, according to the report, 30 years to go from the drawing board to the battlefield. And so the idea is that we're predicting that there's going to be upheavals in the future, and now the military risk assessors are definitely some of the best risk assessors in terms of U.S. interests, and they're not going to deny the consensus of 97% of scientists, and they're saying that this is going to affect U.S. interest, and thus climate change suddenly becomes a new U.S. national security. It becomes a top national. It's declared a national security threat, and really what that means is that it then becomes ingrained in the Department of Defense, and if you look at the 2014 mission statement of the Department of Homeland Security, climate change is declared a national security threat, which affects all of its missions, which are, again, a lot of it is around border policing, immigration enforcement, counterterrorism, and this kind of analysis through the lens of climate change you can see in the very documents of DHS. And so and I'm going to end right here, when I met people in some of my research, especially in Central America and in the borderlands of Mexico, going north because of the drought, that was faithfully already predicted by the U.S. government in its own documents.
Okay. There's a lot I want to comment on, but I'm going to stick to the point. We're going to go to fossil fuels. And I'm going to kind of use this as therapy. Because every time I hear the word fossil fuel, I cringe. I hate it. I think it hides a lot. I also feel the same way about climate change in terms of a title. And the short end of that is that climate change is a way to say that there's this big problem that only governments, corporations, and NGOs can deal with. But when really climate change is just another way to say widespread ecological crisis that's rooted very directly in lots of neighborhoods and things, as we heard so well, that you're confronting. But the same goes for fossil fuels. When I hear fossil fuels, in a sense, everything runs on fossil fuels. I believe this press has a book called Fossil Fuel Capitalism that's very nice to give you a history about fossil fuels. But when I hear fossil fuels, I go, oh man, this is bad. No one's really gonna get to the issue here. Because the fact is, when you hear the word fossil fuels, what's the solution? It's renewable energy, isn't it? You think renewable energy and maybe parts of the green economy, if not all the green economy, depending on how much you pay attention to it, is going to save the world. It's going to be a solution. It's going to mitigate climate change, or because of the mitigation failures, it's going to adapt. Now they're saying they're working on climate change adaptation, which is even stepping back and going towards this resilience nonsense in terms of, the problem's happening, so people are going to have to adapt to it now instead of even trying to mitigate it. But so getting to the point, fossil fuels. I hear people say fossil fuels. I've been arguing with my climate change organizing friends forever, saying you have to get past fossil fuels. Fossil fuels a lie. The dichotomy between fossil fuels and renewable energy is frightening. It's a huge problem. And I think we're going to be talking about later some ways to change and organize and maybe possible ways to do things. And I think the first step is that it's more than fossil fuels. It's mineral extraction. It's renewable energy. There's nothing green about it. There's nothing sustainable about it. It actually has a very dystopic possibility, even in its positive sense, of that it can renew things. So let me explain. What, for me, what I don't, oh, okay. I'm pretty loud.
Speak into the mic.
Feel important. For me, what upsets me, and I was at some party the other night, and I asked someone, because it's just the way that people are patterned to think is driving me crazy at this point, where I say, yeah, what about wind turbines? What about solar energy? What about all this infrastructure, this very clear metal infrastructure full of wires, full of aluminum, full of copper, full of rare earth minerals? What in your mind makes you think that that's green? They don't even paint them green half the time. Like, we don't even have this to kind of call it green. But everyone still clings to it. I hear environmental justice organizers give very good analysis of environmental racism and how they're building technologies and putting waste into poor neighborhoods in Texas and other places. But then at the end of their talk, they'll say, oh, but we're doing renewable energy transition and things like this. The environmental racism and putting waste into poor neighborhoods is exactly what renewable energy is doing on a global scale. It's the same kind of path dependency, kind of world system dynamic of saying, oh, this is green, but we need your copper, we need your rare earth minerals, we need a ton of steel. And it's reproducing the exact same dynamic, which goes into the next thing. How much energy is this actually producing? What is this infrastructure we have? What are all these computers? What is this crazy mess? I mean, you talked about the oil pipeline, you talked about the oil fields looking like a computer. Man, this thing, the cities really are just giant humans reproducing computers on a scale where we're just the little energy blips going through it. And renewable energy is extending this, it's intensifying it. So while people think that it's a solution, it's actually not, it's intensifying the problem. I did a lot of work on climate change conflict in the military. A lot of renewable energy and natural capitalist schemes with conservation, with carbon and biodiversity offsets. They're not only intensifying environmental degradation through these new schemes, there's more carbon being cut, and that's another story, and I'm gonna try to stay on track. But there's also an increase in conflict, and I come from a situation where I did my doctoral fieldwork and work in Mexico, where they built 1,608 turbines. There's more now, and there's indigenous communities that are breaking against their old radical political leaders of yesteryears and are fighting to defend their land and sea, right, to get better cuts of the profits also. But there's a lot of people that have a deep relationship with the sea and are trying to stop the spread of renewable energy. And we're talking about 1,608. How much energy does that produce? How many more of those do you need? And what is green about it? And I'll tell you really quick. I have my nice little notes. Let's see if I can read them. So here's the impact for wind energy. So this nice green technology, first thing it does, it goes into an area. It cuts down all the trees, all the animal habitat, displaces the animals. It begins either building subterranean power lines or above ground power lines. It begins digging about anywhere from 12 to 17 meters deep into the ground, about a 21 to 32 kilometer wide hole that they then fill with concrete and rebar, roughly 150 metric tons of steel just for the foundation. If you have any groundwater, like is the case in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec region, all of a sudden whatever sweet drinkable water that's there, you're filling it with concrete. You're more or less, as a lot of people say, you're filling the veins of the earth with concrete. Then you're building a roughly 500 metric tons of steel tower, which then uses rare earth minerals and copper as a conductor and for wiring. For apparently to like Business Insider or one of these sources, for every single megawatt, and one wind turbine is roughly 2 megawatts, now they're making 2.5, now they've got a new technology that they're doing a couple more, but you need 3.6 tons of copper. And I just came from a copper conflict down in Peru, which again is another story, and it's brutal, it's violent, there's cops shooting people in the head, cutting off electricity to people, abducting them at night, and horrible stuff, and it's not uncommon. The beautiful thing, and something I like very much that you said, so rare earth minerals, they're in everything, and I can't pronounce half of them, but neodymium and dysprosium are key to just about every electronic smartphone, everything, and they didn't use them before 1980. There's 0.01 used before 1980, and now they're in everything. And about between 1990 and 2009, 97% of these came from 2 mining sites in China, one in Inner Mongolia and one in the southwest, Right now, it's about 83% of all these rare earth minerals come from there. Rare earth mineral extraction, I found out relatively recently, like a year ago, is actually on league with uranium mining, which I didn't know. And you more or less, out of 1 ton of ore, it's different in these two sites, but in the Inner Mongolian site, you get roughly about anywhere from 0.3 to 0.6 out of 1 ton. So that means you're gonna have about 95% waste that is littered with various industrial waste, thorium, radioactive nuclides, nuclear waste on various levels of radioactivity. And we're not even talking about the labor issues. We're not even talking about all these types of things. But a BBC reporter who got into China to do these things, describes these industrial environments as hell on earth. The tailing ponds are measuring 3 times background radiation. And there's not much information known about that. I have a grant to go deal with this. We'll see what happens. I don't even want to deal with it because I already know the answer and it's messed up. Why do I need to know the exact measurements? Academia is a dead end. But so I want to keep this quick, but there's a lot of issues. And this is not in the fossil accounting. We're talking about the solution, and the solution is a nightmare. And this isn't even going into the socio-ecological impacts of the environment in terms of land deals, in terms of how they're actually seizing the land of indigenous people, or how they are negotiating it, either at gunpoint, intimidation, using illiteracy of not using indigenous knowledges, getting middlemen to do it who are incentivized for giving them low cuts for their land. But the real deal breaker, because we can pretend like, yeah, okay, it's renewable, these things only last for 30 years, but there's a renewable element. And besides, we have to ask what we're powering, like, do we want to make this society renewable? Do we want it to continue like this? And that's what it's doing. It's prolonging this society. It's prolonging the police. It's prolonging the military. It's prolonging the racism. It's prolonging the violence. So there's that issue. But the crazy thing is, of these 1,608 wind turbines, what's this energy being used for? It's being directly exported out of the region, not only to, it's going to the US, it's going to Los Angeles, it's going to Guatemala, but worse, it's going to industrial centers in Mexico that are owned by mining companies, of which I just checked in on one in Peru who is spreading insane amount of terror amongst the population in this farming area. But it's going to mining companies, it's going to industrial construction companies, it's going to Walmart, it's going to pretty much everything I don't really want to have exist personally. I just don't think it's good for things. I think it makes a bad relationship. I don't think it's very healthy. Oh yeah, I just realized that. So what's this energy being used for? And that's another aspect. So when I hear fossil fuels, there's this dichotomy between fossil fuels and renewable energy is a false one, or maybe at best it's a nice lie, because at the end of the day, what's going on is every single aspect of renewable energy is built on some type of fossil fuel or mineral extraction that people are completely delusional and denial about, especially environmental activists, which hurts my feelings. And yeah, it's not nice because there's not really many more places to cling to hope other than to maybe kind of recognize that industrial systems have it coming and that we have to decide how to come to terms with that. And yeah, we'll end it there.
This is why we need to have this conversation. Against this significant challenges that we face, that we've just heard about, the next set of reflections revolves around where we see the most effective strategies for organizing, for engaging, and working towards change.
So you want me to follow that? I think you all need to take a second and breathe deeply, because I feel like going home and slitting my wrists after listening to that. Capitalism isn't just the extraction of Mother Earth. It's also part of the culture of how people talk about issues, how they speak for communities of color, and how they even critique the solutions being led by people of color. It is the entitlement, the being able to be the expert on everything. I'm not an expert on anything. I'm learning constantly, and my language is constantly changing. I want to talk a little bit about Puerto Rico. And I want to also talk a little bit about just transitions, because just transition was always about a process that was clean from beginning to end, respecting people's rights, the chemicals and the materials that were used, that the process had to be as clean as the output. And so if you go to the Just Transition Alliance or go to Movement Generation and download the zine on Just Transitions, you'll see that that whole process is supposed to be clean from soup to nuts. And that is a process and a framework that was created by the front line of the climate crisis. I want to talk about Puerto Rico for a second because I am Puerto Rican, and Puerto Ricans haven't been important or part of the conversation for a minute, because the fact that we're citizens of the United States makes people think that we should have it all figured out by now, despite our second-class citizenship. I don't think people know that Puerto Ricans in New York City, socioeconomically, our young people are behind every single racial and ethnic group, including new immigrants, and that we're neck and neck with African Americans and indigenous peoples, because we're all colonized people. We have some very basic things in common, and that shows up in terms of our health disparities, in terms of socioeconomic indicators. And so I want to talk about Puerto Rico, because when I went a few weeks ago with Naomi Klein, I went there with my heart heavy, like I literally felt pain in my heart. And I'm somebody who has a lot of health issues as a result of having been born and raised in an EJ community. And I expected to see devastation. What I didn't find was despair. And I didn't find that because what I found in Orocovis, in Humacao, in all of the communities that I went to, were people engaged in food sovereignty, people who were really reclaiming the spaces. They had created their own form of social cohesion where they were building and supporting each other. They were going back to who they were in the beginning before Puerto Rico became a colony of the United States. It was a process of decolonization. And it's that process of decolonization that I think is key to addressing the issue of climate change. Because decolonization isn't just about takings of the land and appropriating a culture, it's the repurposing it to basically take care and service the privilege. And so I saw that happening everywhere in Puerto Rico, from little children. It was very intergenerational. It was very women-led. And it made me feel hopeful, because when I think about the future, I think of Octavia Butler and the parable of the sower. I think about a future where we are living with what we need and not with what we want, and that we've moved away from this extractive culture that has put us in this place. And has definitely destroyed the way of life of people of color who have always lived within their carbon footprint and are now dealing with the consequences of decisions made by those people who colonized, oppressed them, and are still trying to extract from us. In Puerto Rico, what we're seeing is the same thing that we saw in Katrina, what we've seen in all over the United States, which is that people have been pushed out so that land can be privatized. We see nonprofits literally meeting. As of this afternoon, I got an email of nonprofits meeting in the United States to talk about solutions for Puerto Rico. What happens in New Orleans, or what happens after Sandy in New York, was that our solutions were professionalized and a lot of funding was made available to come in for solutions in our community, when what we need is a grassroots, frontline-led, people-to-people just recovery. And so that, you saw that in Puerto Rico. You saw that after Sandy in our communities. There were people who may have been in this room who basically came into communities like the Rockaways and stayed. Instead of supporting, they supplanted. And instead of stepping out after they were needed, stayed and exercised leadership for what was a working class community of color. So those are some of the really big problems that privilege is never checked, and privilege is an obstacle to addressing the issue of climate justice in our communities. In In terms of what things that we recommend, I could tell you that in Sunset Park, where there's a big proposal floating around about offshore wind, we have been talking about it for a minute. And then all of a sudden, all of the big environmental organizations decided they got the funding because a coalition is created every 5 seconds. And while it takes us a while to get to funders to support the work that we're doing on the ground, it only takes you 5 minutes to put together a group of people to talk about the work that we do and get it funded really well. When we were talking about offshore wind, we weren't talking about bringing the pieces from Europe on ships that would be spewing diesel on EJ communities. We were talking about how do you retrofit an industry that's already doing wind, and how do you create industrial hubs so that we can have jobs on the industrial waterfront. So we do think about the life of things and how you take an industrial waterfront and make it the solution to regional problems while providing local jobs and addressing the health disparities in our community. We try to be thoughtful like that. I'm trying to think of, you said so much that you threw me off completely. And so I just really want to come back to some of the solutions. So when we started to talk about, and when I say we, I'm talking about the Climate Justice Alliance, was already talking about what's called a just recovery before Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. We were talking about a just recovery because of what happened in Houston. We were concerned about the community of Houston because it's surrounded by petrochemical industries. Years ago, when I was the chair of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, I was urging the NEJAC, the EPA, to please look at how communities that were completely surrounded by chemical industries would be affected in extreme weather events. I knew that there would be superfunds created, brownfields. I knew that there would be projectile dust. I knew that all of those chemicals, the toxics and the toxicants, would be ingested by a community that historically has been the reluctant host to all those to all that infrastructure, to all of that extraction, and to all of those burdens. And they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to talk about climate change. And they didn't want to do the study that I was asking for and it happened only after Sandy hit New York. So we were already predicting that what happened to New York was going to happen. What was going to happen, what happened in Houston was going to happen. We already, as a community, knew that that was the case. And we were talking about air quality, land. We were talking about what happens when our community is exposed to this over a period of years. In Puerto Rico, for example, all of the power plants and all of the extractive industry has been built on agricultural land, and people have been literally pushed downwind from all of the emissions. In addition to that, before the storm, 85% of the food, or 85% came from here, and the 15% that they had for agriculture was wiped out by the storm. And now people want to repatriate. They want to buy back the land so that they can actually engage in food sovereignty, and the United States is preventing them from doing that. They basically have Puerto Rico on lockdown, like they're inmates, like they have to depend on the United States if they're even going to get food or water. So Puerto Rico really is, I think, the best example of the historical abuse of what happens to a people who have been subjugated for so many years, what happens to their economy, what happens to their health, the quality of their air, how that land is used to basically serve the interests of the privilege. But people on the island are doing this. They're trying really hard to reclaim the lands and to basically build and to plant seeds. They're talking about what does a decolonized diet looks like, because honestly, the diet that has been imposed in Puerto Rico has created diabetes, high blood pressure, all of the health disparities that couldn't be addressed because there were no hospitals, no electricity, and still, as we speak, there's no electricity in Puerto Rico. And when people talk about renewable energy in Puerto Rico, the conversation is the same as we're having in our communities. Renewable energy will be owned by who? Who owns that? So is it Tesla that's going to come into Puerto Rico and basically run the grid and provide yet another economic opportunity for a U.S. business in Puerto Rico? Or will people in Puerto Rico be able to live off the grid? We sent, because we don't know solutions beyond the ones that we know, solar cubes, solar generators, because Puerto Rico was getting a lot of diesel generators, and Puerto Ricans, I don't know if you know, lead in the world on levels of asthma. And so these generators were making the air yellow, and people were breathing that in. So we sent solar generators, we sent solar-powered refrigerators, bicycles, so that people could get out of their cars and go into the mountains, water filtration devices, because Puerto Rico has been inundated with one-serving water bottles of plastic bottles of water that have now created a garbage problem in Puerto Rico. And people in Puerto Rico are saying no, that they want water filtration devices. So this disaster has not only created a front line that is resisting at every level. They have about 60 organizations that are meeting and creating a platform with climate justice at the center. They're not calling it that. They're not calling it that. They could call it whatever they want to. But what they're talking about is renewable energy, and they're talking about owning these things. They're talking about taking entire parts of Puerto Rico off the grid and living off the land. And that's our future. That's our future here. We're going to end up learning a lot from Puerto Rico if Puerto Rico was able to survive what just happened. So I think that it's really important that we leave feeling that there are things that are happening in frontline communities that bring hope, that basically help us not only reclaim traditions in the past that had us living, respecting Mother Earth and its people, but that actually embraces technology that moves us forward. Because what we need to do right now has to be aggressive, has to be fierce, because we're literally like we're freaking dying. It feels like what's happening in Puerto Rico is genocide. And it feels like what's been happening in our communities is genocide. And the answers can't all be with one group of people. And it has to be done in a way that is democratic, and it has to be frontline led. So I'm usually, I think, a lot more, let's say, I guess more eloquent than this. But I think that the brother just like really made me feel hopeless. You did, bro. You made me feel hopeless. And I can't do that. I got to be able to breathe. I need to feel that there's something that we can do to change things, that we can make New York State go 100% renewable, that we can stop the siting of fossil, that we can build and grow a whole generation that's intergenerational, that generations aren't pitted against each other, that we're working with each other and learning across the table and imagining a future like our ancestors imagined us. Because I wouldn't be here right now if my ancestors, if people in shackles, hadn't imagined a future that made me possible. So I have to believe, and not to criticize you, it's just that it was hard. I have to believe that if we work with each other and we build community power and we do the block by block organizing and people check their privilege and we use everything that we need, that we're going to be able to slow this shit down, because our survival is literally at stake. I have to believe that. I wake up and think about climate change every single day. People know who are in this room know that. I'm here, I'm leading to something else. I'm going to be out to go to Jackson, Mississippi at 5 in the morning. Next week, I'm going to Phoenix. I am somebody who had a bilateral pulmonary embolism and almost died 2 years ago, and I don't even smoke. My father died from an asthma attack at the age of 50. This shit for me is personal. And so I need to believe that the people in this room, in coalition and in solidarity, not speaking for, the front line is going to make a big difference. I got to believe that. Sorry, passing notes.
What was the question again?
Oh, man, I'm sorry. I got it right here. Look, I got it.
Nietzsche's in the house over here.
This is it.
Academics is there.
Effective strategies for organizing.
I know, I got it. I'm teasing.
Change.
Okay. I was thinking, a lot about what both y'all said, and I was a pretty religious person when I was growing up. I was deeply into the church. I went to a Lutheran school, and I remember being fascinated at the creation story, and Adam and Eve. This idea of the first two human beings, and how utopian the world was at the beginning, and this tree of knowledge that existed that was forbidden, and that you couldn't eat from it, and that Adam and Eve were naked at the beginning, but they didn't care. That's cool. They still had eyes, they could see. It wasn't like they were blind or anything, it wasn't a problem until they ate the apple, right? From the tree of knowledge. And I feel like this is where my brother here is at. He's like overwhelmed by, the realities. And you said academics is dead, but you're really like deep into the facts of the situation. And the facts are, like you said, it's like renewable energies still require materials. They still require, elements and things to be built. And anything that is built in a mass scale adds up. That's the reality of it. And, the problem is that a very select few of people have had the ability of controlling, what our world can look like and should look like. That's the problem. Yep. We need autonomy. We need self-determination. We need to move away from, this concept of cash crops. I'm thinking of an awesome song by Tribe Called Red called Virus. They go through all these cash crops: coffee, cotton, sugar, oil, gas. It's like we're so uncreative. It's like we find something that people want and we just exploit the shit out of it till it's fucking gone. All of it. And any little waste product that's left of it's like, let's make something else from this. And then let's make something else from that. And we've been cheating ourselves of the future. We have literally used resources that took millions and millions of years to produce, to be made, and without thinking about the consequences, we used it all up in almost 1 century. That's going to have an impact. Sorry. And if we don't, step up to that and be honest about that, and be honest about who made those decisions, who profited from those decisions, who continues, to live with the privilege of those decisions that were made, then we're not going to get to the solutions. So that's, for me, a very, very big part of the problem. And the solution is going after those targets and, holding people accountable for that. And that's why I think, colonialism is very important. Doctrine of discovery, papal bulls, capitalism, all of these things are real, legal forces that have driven these systems that have allowed a very small amount of people, to exploit the resources of the world and to dictate who gets to live, who gets to die, who's expendable. It's not us. And yet we live in a society. I was born here in the U.S. that is also, complicit by mere fact of being a citizen of this country. And so I have to own that too, and I have to process what that means for me, and I think each of y'all have to do the same. So when I think about, the immigration issue, it's hard because this has always been my land and my people's land. It's like I don't see myself as an immigrant. I don't.
You're not.
I'm not. And so, when I can't even engage in a conversation about immigration because it just doesn't make sense to me. And the idea of owning property, and buying and selling land, and it's so foreign, it's so foreign to me. And I was raised here, it's like, and I knew as a kid, that's just weird. What do you mean you own that land there? There's petroglyphs, historic places in Texas that are owned by people. It's like, it doesn't make any sense, The sun, like, we're gonna take the sun and capture its energy, and and then I can sell it to anyone, because I captured it, I discovered it. I think it's more a psychological problem, it's an academic problem, it's, like we've got a disease of the mind that has really woven deep into, our inability to find solutions because we're not doing that self-reflection. And that's in the Jimenez principles too, by the way. That's a big component, it's a big part of it, self-reflection. And that's what we don't have a whole lot of. And we can't just expect, an individual or a group, or a government to come up with solution. Like, we all have to be part of that. So I didn't offer any specifics, but, that's how I operate. And I applaud communities who, have the courage, at the very least, to try something. I know solar and wind are not the answer, but if it frees their community from toxics, then that's good. But I'm going to challenge them too. It's like, well, where are these products coming from? Think about that before you engage in that. Is there child labor in China? Like, we're just as bad if we're okay with the fact that negative impacts are put on someone else, even though I can't see them. And so my mom had a windmill on her farm, and it provided electricity for their house. And I don't think rare earth minerals were around then. So
It's possible without them.
So it's possible to have, and I remember reading in the books, wind energy was used to move water. There's acequias in New Mexico and Texas. There are solutions that have always been there. They weren't called solutions, they were just, innovations. And I'm sure they had their problems too. It's taking from somewhere else. And so the idea of sharing, being cognizant of the fact, that you're using what you need and not more than that. All these very basic, simple concepts of fairness and just. That's why we say just recovery, because it's systemic. We're not just thinking about me. It's everyone. I'll stop there.
Because Elizabeth has to leave, Todd and Xander, forgive me, maybe we could see if there's some questions and then have you guys jump in a few minutes with some more contributions.
Make a 5-minute quick clarification.
Yeah, there'll be time for that. How about 2 minutes?
2 minutes, better. I just want to be clear that I'm speaking about industrial scale systems.
Yeah.
A lot of what you're saying about Puerto Rico off the grid and things like this sounds very nice. And just to keep this short, I think in terms of how we're thinking about what the colony is, this is an infrastructure. It's a state infrastructure. And I'd even go as far as to say that the grid is the embodiment of colonial structures. And I would love to see experimentations around degrowth, around post-development, around decolonization of how to actually break the grid and to get into some kind of interesting ways to do things. And yeah, I don't want to take up time.
But you also said the environmental justice community says, and you flagged the environmental justice, and I responded to that because we have, because what Brian said was really on point, which is that anything that we support that has a negative impact on someone somewhere is something that we reject. We look at the entire life process, and that's hard, and that's why environmentalists haven't wanted to work with us because they think we're too slow and too process-oriented, and they're very much about solutions like this without thinking about how that process really actually kills our people. When we were talking about solar panels, for example, we said, well, where are they going to build them? Are they building them in our community, and is that process toxic?
Yeah.
Those are questions we've been asking ourselves and each other for a long time and trying to come up with what we call just transitions, because we think that's how you operationalize something that moves us away, an economic structure that moves us away from extraction. So that's, but I'm good. I mean, you just freaked me out.
No. A lot of what you're
freaked me out.
a lot of what you're saying is very good, and I can tell you the environmental justice people are saying that. And what you're saying is actually a breath of fresh air from a lot of what I'm hearing. But if anything, what I'm trying to highlight is that a lot of the stuff that's being critiqued is exactly what's being exported to other places, indigenous groups, other rural people who are getting hit with the exact same stuff, even harder. Paramilitary, rape is a weapon of pacification. And it's related to renewable energy, sorry.
I have to leave, and I got.
Yeah,
I think
okay,
you
so
have
we
my-
want to make sure that the audience has an opportunity to engage with the panelists. Part of this is bringing organizers, folks thinking about these kinds of questions together. So would anyone like to step forward to ask your first question? We know that there's only about 10 minutes, and I do have two very quick announcements. One is that the issue is for sale, so on your way out, please support NACLA. We need everyone's support. And in an era where a lot of left presses are no longer doing print, NACLA is surviving and thriving. So please sign up with Sam, raise your hand, Sam, for the newsletter to continue getting announcements about events and all of the NACLA sort of news. Thank you. Questions? Or responses to some of what folks said? Sure.
Hi. I just want to thank the panelists, especially Elizabeth. I learn so much from you every time I'm in the same room as you. But my question is actually for Todd. I wanted to discuss declaring climate change as a national security threat. Because to me, that kind of sounds like a good thing. Like, okay, we're going to declare this, global uprooting of our ecosystems as a global or a national threat and declare war on it. I mean, that sounds great. But knowing America and its imperial powers, that's probably not how they're going to approach it. So I guess, from an expert who knows, the capabilities of the US government and how they operate behind closed doors in terms of, US military and mass surveillance and trade and whatnot, what isn't too crazy for us to imagine and prepare for?
Oh, man. I mean, I want to be brief because I know Elizabeth has very little, short amount of time. But one of the things as a part of my research, I do go to like Homeland Security conventions and border technology conventions, and they're kind of like going into like a science fiction futuristic scape where everything imaginable as far as surveillance technologies, from robots to drones to biometrics, facial recognition, your worst nightmares of the kind of Orwellian futures are all kind of concentrated there for you to see. And it's almost like you get a glimpse of the possibilities. Obviously, a lot of the stuff isn't deployed. It comes from a lot of private companies that are trying to sell their wares to like Department of Homeland Security or the military. And a lot of it is not being deployed, but you get to see what is being pitched. And the fact that drones are being deployed right now, and maybe 20 years ago they would have been thought of as just some sort of fantasy in somebody's mind, shows you like how quickly this thing can move and how quickly new things can get deployed and the kind of future that we might have before us.
I just want to make a comment on your point about degrowth. You raised a very good point. I think we face an existential crisis if we don't massively, radically suppress fossil fuels. Our goose is cooked, and yet there's no free lunch here. Renewable energy costs all kinds of resources and so forth. But I don't think that what you want to say, I mean, and there are happy, there's sort of happy-faced people like Bill McKibben and so forth say, well, we just need to electrify the place and replace, fossil fuel cars with electric cars. But I think you make the point that that's not a real solution. What we need to talk about, though, is not going back to living in log cabins and riding horses, but to deindustrialize, get rid of the industries we don't need, and retrench industries that we could do less of, like fly less, drive less, do away with disposable products industries, and all kinds of things like that, so we can get the whole world to a happy medium that's sustainable for people and for the future.
I want to say something about that because I have to leave. A group of people did a fundraiser for us, and I just really need to head to Bed-Stuy to express my gratitude. So what we talk about is a just transition. And when we talk about a just transition, when we look at our people who are down in the coal mining in Kentucky, guys can't hear me? When we're talking about our people in Kentucky, we can't just say, we're going to deindustrialize. People need jobs. And those have always been, but let me finish, those have always been the solutions of environmentalists who have the privilege that they don't have to think about where they get the next paycheck from. So our people need some place to work. So we, for example, don't have a good relationship with the unions because the unions don't even want us to say, keep it in the ground. And we've got these tensions, but we haven't been able, as a movement, to be able to offer something that's going to take the place of those jobs that we want them to leave, to move into an industry that is clean, that is non-extractive. And that's the work. That's the work that we have to do. So we have to be careful about what language we use because that language divides, and it creates class tension between people who need to put food on the table and people who can have esplanades and open space and pristine environments because they can afford to live like that. And so for us, as people who come from the working class, who are part of the environmental justice community, we're always trying to think about what are the solutions that make it possible for us to transition from an extractive economy to one that's regenerative, to one where we're living, where we have an economy that respects Mother Earth and its people. That's really important to us, that concept of just transitions. If we talk about it in a way and we invent new language that pits generations against each other and pits class against each other, we're going to lose. We're going to lose because the working class is just going to dismiss us and say, my God, that's great for you, but I got to feed my children. And that's been the classic separation between the environmentalists and people in our communities. The environmentalists who, they look at the waterfront in Sunset Park in our community and they're like, ooh, open space. And our community is like, ooh, we need jobs. And how do we make sure that we retrofit the polluting industries that are on the waterfront so that they operate, they're carbon neutral, but at the same time, there are places where we can make things, we can build, and we can build for a climate future. Those are the complicated conversations that we're having, and I would urge you to be really careful that your solutions are not coming from a place of first of all, that it's an individual response, that you, in your wisdom, have the answer to this. These are collective decision-making processes. We have to engage communities because the answers are in that collective decision-making, and that you're not coming from a place of privilege where you are not seeing how your recommendations are going to impact the people who are not at the table. Really important. Language is super important. That we are careful with that. So deindustrialization, Sunset Park, we want industrial jobs. We want them. We think that the industrial sector should be building for New York City's climate future and not creating another commercial sector for the privilege to come to have, $24 cups of coffee and avocado sandwiches, from Italians that suddenly discovered avocados in Mexico. That's not what we want. We want an industrial sector that is making all the development in Brooklyn carbon neutral, because all of that development, all those people who are displacing us, that are destroying our social cohesion and putting us in harm's way in terms of extreme weather events, that's more energy, more waste, more everything. And so those buildings should all be carbon neutral, and you have to build for that somewhere, and where you build for that is in the industrial sector. So we don't want to deindustrialize. That's what's happening right now. Sunset Park is becoming like Williamsburg, like Chelsea. It's the new Williamsburg, because people are now bored with Williamsburg, like what Zumbo is now, right? And so what that means is that you get your $24 cup of coffee, but you don't also get to talk about climate change. Some places have to be places where we work, and we need to have an industrial sector in New York City. And they have to be in our waterfront so that we can actually use the water as a way of getting goods in and out. We should be using the industrial waterfront to talk about food security and connecting New York City to upstate farmers, and basically making it possible to address the issue of food in New York City in the event of an extreme weather event. So those solutions exist in our industrial sectors. They just don't look like the industrial sector that we have now. And so I would urge you, because I gotta go, I'm going to Bed-Stuy to this thing. It's a comedy thing, and I gotta laugh. I would urge you to be careful with language. And so and also, guys, thank you. I'm sorry if I talk too much. I don't like hijacking space. But I am the only woman on the panel, with the exception of our sister here who's asking the questions. So I gotta represent. Love.
Hi. Do I have to do anything to this? Okay. I guess what I'm sort of meditating on as I'm listening to all of this, and it's super interesting, is sort of coming from a place of dislocation a bit, like, which is maybe the result of some privilege and also some life choices about moving around to different places and sort of feeling kind of disconnected from different places that I've lived. And I'm back in New York City after a long period of being out of New York. And I'm living on the Upper East Side, which is, it's a neighborhood that's sort of associated with a lot of privilege. And I'm just thinking about like the Upper East Side in relation to someplace like Sunset Park, and like the feeling of being on the Upper East Side is very, like when I think about my block and my neighborhood and stuff like that, it doesn't feel like there are opportunities to like connect with a community, you know what I mean? Even though like members of my family have been living there for decades, like it's not an integrated community in that sense. And yeah, I'm just thinking about that and thinking about coalitions and thinking about like where, I'm not asking for like life advice or career advice, but I'm more just thinking a lot about mental model advice. And obviously it's like really saddening to think about that. Like it's personally sad, but it's like politically sad, because I think there are a lot of people in the world who are like me, who have to really figure out how to anchor into a commitment that feels like what we can offer is worthwhile, sort of. So that's just what if anybody has thoughts on that. Thanks.
Can I comment on this one? So, you know, I feel you, and, you know, this is deeply personal work. It is. And, you know, our responses and even our own self-critique is not to shame or point the finger at or to embarrass, you know, but it's honest conversation. And for me, you know, the thing that helped me best process, you know, the very, very real dangerous situation that we're in was, you know, better understanding my story. Because, you know, my story was taken from me, you know, from centuries of colonization. You know, my language would not be English, and it wouldn't be Spanish either. And yet, you know, when folks look at me, you know, they may see Hispanic, Latino, Mexican American, but even those words are very shallow in terms of what they mean to folks. And so, you know, living in a big city can be really difficult, particularly when, you know, you're not from that particular place. And I don't know how to answer or offer any advice except that I take a lot of comfort in going through the process and the journey of discovering what my story is, who my people are, where my land is, you know, and the values that are rooted in that place. You know, when I think of food, you know, food has a particular location that it comes from. And when I eat certain foods, it's way more than just nourishment, you know, and calories. But those are ways that we're taught to sort of think about food, right? Is it going to make me fat? Is it going to, you know, make me sluggish or tired? And those are ways of thinking about things that I think are part of every aspect of our lives that disengage us from, you know, the beautiful thing about being alive and a human and in this world right now, wherever you are. And so when I think of like avocados, like, man, that's deeply rooted in my history and past and culture. And I think about, you know, where they're from, and peppers and jalapenos. And yet I can get all of those things anywhere in the world. You know, and there's something that happens when things are just so easily around and available that never have been for thousands of years. You know, and so that comes at a cost. That comes at a cost and a sacrifice. And if you're not aware of that, you know, when you do become aware of it, it can be discomforting, you know, because those emotions of guilt and shame are real. You know, we all are participating in an economy and a system, you know, that we didn't construct, you know, most of us, but we are operating in it. And so, you know, none of this is on you personally. It's on all of us. But I do think that, you know, if you come from a particular class or ethnic group, you know, in some countries, that means something. And you should own that and understand what that means for you. You don't owe me anything personally per se. You owe it to yourself, you know, so that you're comfortable with who you are. And I think that's a hard place to go for a lot of people. But I thank you for, you know, being open about that in such a public space. You know, that's a good step. And you know, it's we've all had our crying moments of you know, really despair and for the future and the kids. You know, think of the young folks who have to live with the world that we created. You know, the choices that we made. That's really difficult. You know, I've met a couple of young preteens who have died of cancer, for example, you know, in neighborhoods that we organize in. And cancer is something that's supposed to take decades to develop. You know, it's learning. It's getting stronger and faster, you know, because of that generational degradation of our DNA and our bodies and our abilities to fight these things. So yeah, it's real, but you know, I think all of you that are here today acknowledge that it's real, but it's going to take some work on all of us to be real about what those solutions are. You know, so what you said is real. You know, and the military, whew, that frightens that's the most frightening thing I think I heard all night, is that the military is excited about climate change and they want to be a part of the solutions.
They like renewable energy a lot also.
Like renewable
They're
energy.
starting to.
I think we have time for
questions over.
a couple more questions.
There's so many scientific, political, philosophical, personal questions. At the end, there's an, you know, it's an enormity and it's hard to start. But I think we have to operate on many levels at the same time. One is, you know, practical problems that you're addressing here and now locally. But the problems won't be solved unless we tackle the very big problem, particularly of capitalism and its endless drive for growth. Okay? Whether we use renewable energy to go there or fossil fuel energy, that is the problem. And so it's the age-old problem, but ever more pressing existentially, of how do you integrate, you know, the reforms with a revolutionary perspective. And Marx once said pretty much what you said. One day, the idea of owning anyone, even collectively owning the earth, will seem as ludicrous as the idea of a person owning another human being. You know, so we have to put forward we have to challenge ways of thinking about property, you know, and that the earth fundamentally belongs to all of us. I think, you know, here I'm not at all religious, but I think of connecting with religious people, you know, who believe that God made this earth. So it's, you know, it's, you know, it's even worse, you know, from that point of view. Just you know, that it's ours, in human and in generations and generations to come. So we have to put forward those ideas and fight for public goods. You know, make the waterfront in Sunset Park, you know, a place for industry to make public transportation. You know, we have to raise these ideas, even if they seem utopian now, and raise ideas about the real meaning of security. I did a short paper some years ago, right after 9/11, looking at how security is talked about. And security is mostly talked about in terms of intentional threats by others, whether they're an individual person or government or these millions of migrants coming at us, you know. But security has a broader sense, which is actually connected more to women, you know, security just being well-being, you know, and security in that sense requires a healthy climate, it requires a healthy planet, requires clean air, clean water. So we have to start raising these ideas, even if they're only sort of philosophical, you know, futuristic, you know, as we engage in concrete struggles, or else, you know, so.
Hi. First, yeah, thank you all so much. It was really interesting to hear you all talk. And going off of what the last speaker just said, the last person to have this microphone, something that really struck me about the discussion was the contradiction between top-down change, which oftentimes the most large-scale proposals that we get are coming from within our own capitalist system. The contradiction between these models of change and meaningful change, change that actually shifts the power to the people. At the same time, we rarely see the levers of power really shift without some calamity prefacing it. So obviously we have seen so much more activism in the wake of Hurricane Sandy and all of the hurricanes that have struck this year. So I'm curious what you all think. First of all, I'm curious if you agree with that, whether you think that it's just a matter of time before something happens that forces a revolution, or whether you think that in the meantime it's worthwhile to actually build bridges between, I guess, grassroots movements and the current powers that are, whether that's productive or whether that's really just reproduction of the problem.
Anyone?
Give people are looking at me. Yeah, yeah, revolution, that's funny. It's not just top down. It's top down from the bottom up. There's so many different participatory strategies, different techniques of social engineering that governments that are using NGOs, using different type of protest leaders, using different type of business schemes that I think kind of what you're talking about is great to talk about. Yeah, talk to the people in those areas. That's what you should always be doing. I got kind of pegged tonight as being the academic, but I've been on the front line. Actually, I'm going to bring it into kind of what I want to talk about. But I think what's really important, based on kind of a lot of the things that I heard, is to kind of ask, who are you? What do you really want? What are you really mad about? Do you even really care? Or is this kind of a fad that you want to latch on to have a sense of place of being an identity? But to really ask, what do you want? Who are you? And do you even want to attack this system and change it? And not just talk abstractly about colonialism, revolution, or even industrial or capitalism. You know, what are these things? And once you know who you are, and I think I recommend talking to cats, trees, other animals, other caged forms of life that you're with inside cities, and I think you'll recognize that you actually are all in weird concrete boxes and cells, you know, with all sorts of screens that you're kind of taught to look at, and you're really into it, and you're really important. We're clicking the screens and stuff. We're like mosquitoes going towards the blue light. And through that, it's extremely profitable. It's creating new markets. Your rebellion is a new thing to kind of turn up and sell, which continues it, which is another way of the top-down being the bottom-up, but somehow it's us who are producing it and our creative energies. It's the way that this system is holding itself together, the way that we are having very kind of early on conversations about changing and stopping these things, or even what colonialism is, or the way that people are very upset when people say bad things about renewable energy is concerning. And I think really important, who are you? What's the colony structure? What stake do you have in this? Are you always doing solidarity, or are you pissed about the way that this system is treating you? Because I think what's important to remember is that we are all kind of bastard subjects of the colony. A lot of the history of Europe, every state project, this whole industrial system, capitalism, if you like that word, is predicated on genocide and ecocide and slavery. And a lot of the European settler colonists that came here were subject to genocidal campaigns. The English did real well at everything around them, especially women and wolves during the witch hunts, which gave rise to modern science and these things like this. But everyone, I think there's many class issues, there's many race issues, but at the end of the day, I think everyone has a vested interest to ask themselves, how is this system really doing to them? Because I actually think that even rich people, very well-off people, they're just taking all sorts of crazy pharmaceuticals so they can keep checking their finance, check their numbers, cheat on their wives, and their wives are just tearing apart by living in weird, fancy cells, very expensive with all sorts of things. But based on what I heard from you, that's my response, and that really this system is run from the bottom up, even though it's very much top down. And while we have inherited something, we propel it, and we need to actually ask, what is it? How is it going to stop? And really the simple thing is, once you identify the problem, do the opposite. But unfortunately, you'll find out, like I see in the subway, there's going to be a guy with a gun standing behind you to make sure you go to the machine, meaning a cop, so you buy your subway ticket.
On that note, I think Todd will give Todd the last word then.
Oh, I don't know if I deserve the last word. Well, I had a quick story. I guess I'll say that to end. It's about a couple years ago. I went to the U.S.-Mexico border on the Mexican side, to a small rancho that was right smack dab on the border, actually. And they were doing an ecological restoration project there, like a water harvesting project. But the first thing, when I got there, the first thing the people there showed me was actually part of the border barrier that had been dragged about a quarter mile into the United States. Meaning that it was in 2014, there was a big hurricane, and the remnants, the rainstorms, came on the Chiricahua Mountains, which people who are familiar with Arizona, water came down off the Chiricahuas through the dry washes, and just slammed in the U.S.-Mexico border, and just took like parts of the barrier, parts of the wall into into Mexico, and the part of the wall that they were showing me was just about a quarter mile inland, and it had been there for about a year and a half. It was completely buried. Well, not completely. It was the soil was devouring. Planet Earth was devouring this border barrier. I mean, literally devouring it. There was purple flowers growing out of from the soil. There was arachnids and spiders and whatnot that were hanging from it. And I looked at that, and it was on this place called Silver Creek, so you could see straight ahead where they had actually, the Department of Homeland Security had actually reconstructed that border barrier right on the U.S.-Mexico border. And then behind that, there was an idling U.S. Border Patrol vehicle with a green stripe that was kind of watching us. Behind that, there was a newly constructed surveillance tower that's it's a $1 billion or $100 million contract, this surveillance tower. And they showed me, like, before, what they were doing on the Mexican side was actually constructing what they call gabions, which were basically steel cages filled with rocks, and they were embedding it in the stream, right? And so you had, within one visual, one visual, you had these gabions, which actually, they look like intricately carved stone walls on the Mexican side, and they were meant to slow down the monsoon rains or the rains so the soil would absorb the water. Without them, there was a lot of erosion, and replenish the habitat, right? And they're pointing out, well, look, the native grasses are coming back. Look, the desert willow's coming back. Look, this is happening during a 15-year drought, a huge drought that's going on in southern Arizona. Look, the water table has risen 30 feet. Look, it's also risen on the U.S. side. There was no, across the border without being interrogated. Look, also, it's rising. The water table is affecting a community to the south. And when you look at the national security assessments for northern Mexico, one of the things is scarcity of water. So here you have it, like right in front of my eyes was these kind of a tale of two walls, right? And that's what you hear about the border right now. You hear this wall, 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 wall. And then you hear this thing about border security, border security, border security. And it's not questioned, right? It's not unpacked. We don't know what this is. But like last year, 2017, Border and Immigration Enforcement was $20 billion, right? Went to, if you take Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And you look at those $20 billion, and then and I know that this is kind of a small scale project, but what if you took that money and applied it to something else? So I asked the person that was in charge of this ecological restoration project, what if you had $20 billion? What could you do? And then she just looked at me and she didn't know what to say at first, because she was like, wow, I didn't realize they had that much money. And then she started talking, like we could do these projects, all we're doing is piling up rocks to slow the flow of water. We could extend this, and I didn't even understand what she said because she started talking about places so far away, right? And so, like, with that, like, what sort of options do we have? Like, I'm looking at the minuscule option that I was looking at, a small-scale ecological restoration project. But what happens if we take the billions and billions upon billions, and all the billions planned for like a border apparatus or a further security apparatus or this further militarization that we're seeing? We're talking trillions of dollars, and start refunneling that into something else, something that will benefit this planet as we go into this 21st century.
I think we're going to end here, but we encourage people to get wine, mingle if you'd like, and please, please, please support NACLA. And
thank you to
thank you to the panelists, thank you to Verso, thank you to all you guys.
Thank you for hearing what I said.